It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'll be your host this morning. Appreciate you riding with us. Those of you that are joining us on our website, welcome. Thank you. See you folks out there from Philadelphia. I see folks out there in Palm Coast, Sebastian, Florida, Chesterfield, Lincoln, I think that's Nebraska. So, and a few other locations. Don't get scared. I'm not the NSA. I can't tell who you are. I can only see what city you're listening from. So, this is our opening show for this week. Glad to be here. If you're listening to us on Patriot Facebook, that's patriotfb.com. That's great news. We're streaming there on Patriot Radio. We're also available as a streaming live podcast on their website, which is patriotfb.com. FB like Foxtrot Bravo. If you're listening to us on 99.3 Big Country 99 out in South Central Missouri, welcome. Glad to have you. And grateful that the folks over there at Big Country 99 feel strongly enough about our nation that they would be willing to carry a show that's out of genre for a radio station that normally plays country and top popular music. Guys over there wear these ball caps and bill caps and cowboy hats by day, and then they take those off, and at night they put on a tri-corner Patriot hat. So that's good news. We're going to cover a couple of different topics this morning, not the least of which is that we really want to address or take a look at some of the things that are pertinent in our situation right now. One, the courts, because there's some free speech issues out there, privacy, and the topic that I want to kind of focus in on is the mistaken concept that people have that the court is the determining arbiter or the final arbiter of our liberties and our freedoms. And what I posit is that what we see today is nothing more than a form of judicial terrorism from the court systems. When they approve and grant extraordinary powers that are outside of their constitutional authorization, it is exactly that. Some people are polite about it and they call it judicial activism. I don't. I call it exactly what it is, which is judicial terrorism. Why do I say the word terrorism? Well, it's fairly simple. When the premise of a decision or the premise of an action is to create a change in behavior based upon fear, terrorism is the word that jumps to mind as the definition. And so what we see are courts that are, for all intents and purposes, doing essentially that. They are basically determining that we are subject to their rulings by power that they've usurped and given themselves. And that's a problem. Our second topic is going to be extraordinary crisis. Now, that is a statement and a verbatim statement brought out by an individual whose name is Harlan Ullman. And there's a link to the story there about how he works for this think tank. And his concept is that in this Atlantic Council meeting and an article that he wrote, he's basically stating that we need an extraordinary crisis in order to preserve the New World Order. Now, here you see the words from the mouth of a tyrant himself. Forget the source, because a lot of people out there are like, I don't like InfoWars. They're controlled opposition, or they're a Jewish front, and all. I don't even care what the source is. The goal of this show, and if you haven't caught on by now, is the source is not material. More often than not, I post the source up there so that you can see it, read it for yourself, and then make your own determination based upon your own critical thinking, your Socratic critical thinking. I trust you enough that you will not blindly read what you're told and believe it as if it came out of the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Your job is to be discerning, to read between the lines, to identify what the truth and the facts are, separate from the propaganda you're fed, regardless of what the source is. And I don't care whether that's your own favorite bias blog, or your own favorite alternative media, or the mainstream ministry of propaganda, or a speech you hear, or anything else. You have an obligation to utilize your skills, the gift and the brilliance that God has given you, and to tune that with Socratic critical thinking, and then draw your own conclusions to formulate your own opinions, rather than parrot someone else's. So, when people send me arguments that say that, you shouldn't use this link or that link, stop right there. First of all, don't tell me what to do. It's my show. If you don't like it, do your own. Secondarily, the goal of all of this, and you'll see me post articles up there from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times and MSLSD. Are you suggesting that because I post those articles that I wholeheartedly believe in their methodology or thought process or bias? Of course not. So why would you think the same from a conservative or an alternative media source? My job is just to get you to the water. It's your job to drink it and slake your thirst. This elitist monster, in the form of this guy Ullman, is openly suggesting a global false flag event in order to reestablish governmental dominance, because in his own words, he's basically stating that, the internet and the rise of open intelligence that's coming out from alternative media and so forth is dangerous. In other words, it's the old adage of the slaves are reading books and they're becoming dangerous. Our third topic is going to be the NSA will continue its abuse of our Fourth Amendment rights and our privacies and our liberties, despite the president's promises to the contrary. Now, the reason I say that is because the president over the weekend came out and stated that he is going to rein in the NSA, and yet, at the same point in time, we have Feinstein coming out telling us to get used to the idea that there are these massive databases on us, and that we need to get used to it. Our fourth topic is going to be Missouri initiates legislation to restore state sovereignty. So let's talk a little bit about those when we get a chance. Before we get into our first topic, which is the courts and free speech, privacy, and judicial terrorism, let's quickly make sure that you're supporting and patronizing our listeners, or our advertisers. You can find the guys over at Patriot Cigar and Tobacco Shop. They're at Court Square in West Plains, 417-257-1776. Make sure that while you're there and you're picking up a cigar or a pipe or tobacco or whatever your accessory is, that you slip into Wits End Classic Barbershop. Get yourself a haircut. I'm sure you'll be glad that you did. Great opportunity to meet some other great fine folks, by the way, that hang out in there and go in there and get their hair cut, and also go into the back in the Patriot Cigar and Tobacco Shop. Make sure that you visit Jason Henry over on Court Square if you are in West Plains, if you have a legal issue that you need to deal with. He handles both federal and state cases, which is unusual for this area, in the sense that not a lot of attorneys are qualified to practice in front of federal court. he is. And not only is he qualified, but he's, you have to go through a court approval process, and of course he's done that. He does practice in federal court, and he specializes in federal gun cases as well as state firearms cases. So make sure that you visit him or call him at 417-256-4100. He also does other criminal cases like DUIs and things like that. Make sure you see our friends over at Pizza Hut on Porter Wagoner Boulevard. They can take care of you for lunch virtually every day of the week. On Tuesday nights, they have a family night where kids under 12 eat free. And so you can get in there and for relatively little dollars, do a family meal. And then, of course, our friends over at Battery Station, they can be reached at batterystation.com. And you can also call them at 417-257-7799. Okay. Excuse me, I'm still getting over this. I lost my voice as a result of being sick. So if you'll forgive me the fact that I am hoarse and scratchy, not much I can do about it at this point. If you'd like to call into the show to put your input into any of these issues, including courts and so forth, you're welcome to do so. You can call us at 417-204-5141. It's 417-204-5141. You can also call into our listen line, and you can listen to the program 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at your leisure, on your personal National Security Administration or sponsored personal tracking device, the one that you have unlimited minutes on. That you can simply do, or a home phone if you like. That number is 415-325-0725. It's 415-325-0725. It's a great way for you to catch AVN and share it with friends instead of sending them a link or something like that. Or just give them that phone number and tell them, look, just call this and listen to the show for an hour. And you'd be surprised how many people will continue to come back time and time and time again. Of course, you can always find us at americasvoicenow.org. So here's the deal. The U.S. Supreme Court has stated that they're going to weigh in on cell phone searches by the police. Now, here's the problem that we have. For starters, the idea that the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of the Constitution and of the liberties addressed therein is a misnomer. In other words, it's a false choice that we're constantly beaten with or beaten over the head with. The Supreme Court is not the final arbiter of the Constitution. The fact of the matter remains that our founders told us that it was not the Supreme Court, but the people themselves. In fact, Alexander Hamilton made a very clear statement to that effect, and here's what he said. Quote, I maintain that and by the way, this is in reference to not the Supreme Court, but the Supremacy Clause. Now, for the record, the Supremacy Clause, as you know, everyone says that federal law trumps state law, and this relates to nullification issues and such. I maintain that the word supreme imports no more than this, that the Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof cannot be controlled or defeated by any other law. The acts of the United States, therefore, will be absolutely obligatory as to all the proper objects and powers of the federal government. But the laws of Congress are restricted to a certain sphere. And when they depart from this sphere, they are no longer supreme nor binding. Now, that statement, which was addressed and pointing towards the Supremacy Clause itself, also addresses the Supreme Court. Because when the Congress, or any law made by any administrative agency, which of course they didn't have at that time, when it departs from the sphere of laws which are passed in pursuance of the Constitution, when they depart from that, then those laws are no longer supreme nor binding. And I would dare say to you that when we talk about things like the court the other day came out and stated that bloggers have a First Amendment protection. Now, this is a federal appeals court, so it may well go to the Supreme Court yet, but here's the point. Why is it that we feel like we need the courts to verify for us that which our founders expressed to us clearly in writing, pointed out and clarified repeatedly over and over and over again, and furthermore, which our Creator gave us and embedded in us. I mean, you know that you have a right to free speech. You don't need someone to confirm that or affirm that for you. I mean, thanks for telling us, court, what we already know to be the case. That God has imbued us with those rights of free speech and free thought. And our founders clarified it for us in writing to make sure that we fully understood that those were rights that were not granted to us by government, but by God itself. And we've really known this all along. I mean, you know in the back of your mind that your right to free speech and privacy and right to possess a firearm for your own self-defense and the defense of your nation, and your right not to be coerced or tricked or manipulated or threatened into speaking out against your own best interest, you know all of those things are natural human rights. Again, I point to something Jefferson said. This is related directly to the court. You seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiter of all constitutional questions. It's a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. Now, here's what I want you to do. This is up on our Facebook page. It's up on our YouTube. It'll be in the body of the YouTube discussion here. What I want you to do is I want you to read that statement a few times until it really, truly sinks in. I want you to take it and take those words, and I want it like a cookie. I want you to put them in your mouth, and I want you to chew them. And then I want you to sit there and just taste them. Because I want you to fully understand and memorize the concept, the taste, the texture, the tone of truth. You seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions. A very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. When he said that, he was referencing the Supreme Court itself. He was stating that the Constitution never created a godlike figure in the SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States. When you hear me say SCOTUS, that's what I'm talking about. Nowhere did the Constitution or the founders ever believe that SCOTUS had some exclusive right or final determinative capabilities of law or constitutional rights. For the court to believe that they have the right to rescind or strip or limit your rights, or to make a determination on whether cell phone searches by police is legal, is hubris, arrogance, and self-serving. It's judicial terrorism. If they find against you, against your best interest, against natural law, against God-given law, against creator law. That's it, folks. The court doesn't have a right to decide whether police can search an arrested criminal suspect's cell phone without a warrant. You see, they have given themselves that right. They've usurped it. In fact, I had a discussion with an attorney about this the other day. And he's adamant about the fact, of course, he's an attorney, so he's been trained with the mentality that the courts can make the determination of what is right and what is wrong, and what is constitutional and what's not, what is the extent to which government can determine your rights. Well, I completely and wholeheartedly disagree with the concept. Under no circumstances does any court have the right to make the determination as to what my Creator has embedded and imbued within me as a human being. And it doesn't matter whether I live in the United States or elsewhere. The idea that some court can make that determination on my behalf and then place me under the stricture that they have created to define where my rights end is a misnomer. This, ladies and gentlemen, is how tyranny gives and grants itself credibility and authority. It makes a determination in a governmental sense, usually under legislative decree, and then uses the courts to put a stamp of approval over that, effectively granting itself authority and power it does not possess. And that is judicial terrorism. It's not judicial activism. Activism is completely different. This is a level of coercion which is tantamount to holding a gun to your head. Because the implication is that those courts can then utilize whatever those new powers are to grant authority they don't have the authority themselves to grant to agencies like police departments, the NSA, the CIA, the FBI, the EPA, and you can go on down and down and down the list. Just because 9 justices sit up there and say that we have determined in our infinite wisdom, which I would question from Jump Street, that it's legal or illegal. See, here's the problem. The courts, as a general rule, always utilize precedent to look at how to rule in a case. Well, in a true, honest jurisprudence, what would happen is the courts would not look at prior judges' rulings to determine how they ruled on an earlier unrelated case. What would happen is the courts would go back to the intent of the contract, what the founders had to say, what their intention was. And I defy any court to read the writings of Thomas Jefferson, and who says, you seem to consider judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions. A very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. And I would defy any judge to read that and then feel as if he or she then has a right to rule on your freedoms and liberties. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the crux of it. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we return, we're going to tackle our second topic, which is extraordinary crisis. This is an extraordinary crisis idea, which is dangerous indeed. We'll be right back. We have returned. You're listening to America's Voice now. So, when I look at government, and I look at courts, and I look at these people who try to determine how they can get around limitations on your individualism, your ability to think freely, speak freely, and so forth and so on, I'm always kind of stunned and shocked and amazed that they actually believe they have the right to determine what's in our best interest. I mean, who is one person or 9 people or 535 people to make a determination that they can decide what the other 315 million of us are going to do? I'm not saying that there should not be any government. I'm saying that government should be so microscopic in its dimension, in its scope, in its influence and impact in our lives that we should have to look for it with an electron microscope in order to find it in our lives. I'm saying that the federal government was intended to be so obscure to the average citizen that it would have almost no impact on their day in and day out life. I'm saying that state governments should be so miniature that you have to look hard to find them in your life. And I'm saying that what totalitarianists and statists of all stripes and blends and flavors all decide is how they can impose their will upon us. And they have no problem whatsoever utilizing whatever tactics are available to them under their scope of authority and power, which more often than not is usurped in the first place, to accomplish that end. Harlan Ullman, he's writing for the Atlantic Council, and he works for a think tank based in Washington, D.C. He has come out and warned that an extraordinary crisis is needed to preserve, quote, the New World Order, which is under threat of being derailed by non-state actors like Edward Snowden is one of the examples he gives, Bradley Manning and others. Now, let's understand what that statement means for a moment, because if you take it in its true context and you think about what he's actually saying here, he's saying that the information that has been presented to the world and the concept that people have access to information through alternative media, a non-controlled source, is dangerous to the status of the tyrants and the elitists themselves. Well, you're darn right it is. But he's calling for an extraordinary crisis in order to regain control. The article says the Atlantic Council, which he works for, is this think tank. It's a highly influential organization, close ties to major policymakers. It's headed up by a group of other government, past government, individuals, including Brent Scowcroft, the former United States National Security Advisor. He was an advisor under Ford and Bush the Senior. And he's also been an advisor to Obama. And Harlan Ullman, the author of this particular article, he was the author of the shock and awe concept that was employed in Iraq when we went in for Saddam Hussein. He's now the chairman of the Kiloween Group, which advises government leaders. So in other words, these people leave their government service, whatever it may have been, migrate into these think tanks, which are funded by God only knows who and what. Many of them are private, so there's no way to know what their funding is all about and where it comes from. And then they utilize their past contacts to essentially influence policy and leadership in the United States. And they always approach it from the perspective of their past experience, which was as a sometimes minor, sometimes major cog in the wheel of tyranny. So what do you think their end result is always going to be? What do you think their policies are going to always engender? He wrote this article entitled "The War on Terror is Not the Only Threat," in which he basically, and I've read it, it's very brief, and you can read it yourself. He's asserting that, quote, tectonic changes are reshaping the geostrategic geostrategic system. And his argument is that our concern should not be things like military superpowers like China, but what we should be concerned about is people like Edward Snowden, Bradley Manning, anonymous hackers who pose the threat to the 365-year-old Westphalian system. Because, get this, they encourage individuals to become self-empowered, eviscerating state control. That's a curious way to look at things, isn't it? In other words, this is the age-old argument that if you let them slaves read and own guns, they're going to want their freedom. What an interesting concept. You know, he's not the first to come out with these kinds of statements. We've heard this many, many times before from all of these elitists. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a monster, and you ought to, if you don't know who he is, you should educate yourself about him. Recently, in 2010, he told the Council on Foreign Relations meeting that the global political awakening, and he's not really referencing only the United States of America, but the planet-wide rise in people who desire freedom and liberty. And he says that it's threatening to derail the one world government movement. Now, Ullman is basically calling for an extraordinary crisis to reinvigorate support for state power and big government. And when you think about that, and we look back at what's been done over historical windows to accomplish that same end, and I'm thinking now the sinking of the Lusitania. I'm thinking of Pearl Harbor. I'm thinking of Hiroshima, Nagasaki. In other words, there is plenty of evidence out there that governments in the past have committed crimes of false flag, of a false flag nature, which have been used to force change based upon government sponsoring or government being the sponsored, dominating factor. In other words, how do we get people to give us more authority, or how do we take authority and then justify its growth and expansion based upon a danger that in most cases is phantom in its nature? Well, the sinking of the Lusitania was a perfect example. The people who sank it knew doggone well that it was in their territory. The Germans sank the Lusitania, but the English and the Americans who were using it to ship and transport weapons, they wanted it sunk. They wanted that event to occur because it gave them the justification to go back to the American people and say, now you should be outraged enough to enable us to, with this extraordinary crisis, kick off a global war. Now, when we look at Pearl Harbor, we see the same exact event or series of events occurring, albeit with a different outcome. But Pearl Harbor was well known that the attack was slated and scheduled and in the works long before it actually occurred. In fact, and this is not me saying this, and this is not some kind of tinfoil hat conspiracy, the evidence is out there, and it's clear for anyone to go look at. We removed 4/5 of the entire fleet from the island just a week prior to the attack because they didn't want to lose the entire Navy. The men and women who died in Pearl Harbor were sacrificed because they needed an excuse to enter the war. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. They needed an excuse to enter into World War II. The American people wanted nothing to do with it, similar to the outcry when we tried to go into Syria not so long ago. Similar to the outcry when we went into Afghanistan, when we went into Iraq. Similar to the outcry when we went into Vietnam, Korea. You see, people, as a general rule, we don't want war. Governments want war. Governments want an excuse to grow and expand their power and authority, and ultimately that always ends up being what? Tyranny. There's no way around it. The concept of government needing control is only a self-serving end in and of itself. In other words, it's a means to an end. And we know from past historical and empirical proof that government, our own government, has utilized the tricks, if you will, of false flag events and extraordinary crises to accomplish just that. So I ask you, are you suggesting, if you believe that I'm incorrect here, are you suggesting that, for all intents and purposes, the individuals that we have in our government today are more trustworthy than the people that led us into World War II, World War I, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan? I hardly think so. In fact, I think the level of moral fiber and resolve in our current society today and reflected in our own government is far lower than it was even then. In fact, I don't think these people even care so much to hide what they're doing like they did back in 1914 and in 1939 and 1941. I don't think they care. I think they're so confident that they have the media wrapped around their finger that they're pretty confident that you're never going to find out about it anyway. Without an extraordinary crisis, writes Ullman, little is likely to be done to reverse or limit the damage imposed by failed or failing governance. Wow. Holy smoke. Listen to that statement again. Without an extraordinary crisis, little is likely to be done to reverse or limit the damage imposed by failed or failing governance. In other words, basically what he's stating here is that unless we have an extraordinary crisis that allows government to utilize that as an excuse to reassert its steely control of tyranny over us, because of the need to contain the new risk or threat, as it may be. I mean, this is unbelievable that the man has the chutzpah, if you will, the hubris, the arrogance to come out and make a statement like that in public. He goes on to say that very few have taken note and fewer have acted on this realization that information revolution and instantaneous global communications are thwarting the New World Order. Well, that tells me a couple of things if I read between the lines there. One, this man is stating the obvious, that they're worried because there is a planet-wide resurgence in the concept of liberty and freedom. Everywhere that you look, with the exception of Islamic dominated theocracies, you see the citizens themselves seeking a relief from government tyranny. And it's not just in the United States of America. The European Union is under an extraordinary amount of pressure from the citizens themselves because they are beginning to see the failed results of this governance concept that government should dictate basically the rules of everything, control all commerce and all manufacturing and all means and method of production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that you're basically here to support them in their effort, whatever that effort may be. The people in the European Union are recognizing the ineptitude, the impotence, and the failure of those who are creating quote-unquote policy that affects their lives, and yet they have no control over the failures of those policies. It's like trying to sit there and herd, all right, if you've ever watched a cattle drive on television, you know that it takes multiple people to continue to move the herd forward and to go back and pick up the stragglers and to make sure that they're moving in the direction that you want them to go. Generally, you've got one person out front who's leading, and then you have others on the flanks and in the rear moving the herd forward and containing those who would, wander off in a different direction. In this instance, what we have is a series of failed leaders who have constantly led us into either a boxed canyon, that means that we have to turn around and backtrack, or they constantly lead us to the edge of a cliff face. And what they're recognizing is that we are not cattle in the sense that we're that easily herded. We want and seek and desire freedom. And we're not willing to just, follow the rump in front of us, so to speak. What that tells you, and for the record, I posted an article up here this morning, which I'm not incorporating into today's programming, but there is a serious financial crisis about to bubble and burst in China. The article is called Mega Default in China is scheduled for January 31st. They have the same problem about to explode in their system that we had back in 2008. In other words, loose capital and loose lending policies, high interest rates for these loans that are based upon nothing. There is the Chinese state media reported from the China Credit Trust Company and was warning investors they may not be repaid when one of their wealth management products matures in January 31st. The Industrial and Commercial Bank of China told the China Credit Trust products sold the China Credit Trust products to its customers, and now they're suggesting that they may not be able to compensate those investors when it comes time for the maturity of those. Now, when you were talking about this is a $500 million security, and the coal company that they lent the money to borrowed it at something like 12%. Now they're, of course, unable to come up with the money to pay the bond back, and so it's threatening to. And here's what you need to know about this. This is the first of a series of similar dominoes that are behind the Chinese growth. My point is simply this. The United States, the European Union, and the Asian world under the Chinese domination recognize that we've reached a point at which and including the IMF, in which we've limited ourselves out. We've tapped out all the resources that there are to tap. We can no longer manufacture money from nothing. We have debt that exceeds our global planetoid assets in magnitudes, by the way. And so they are looking for an excuse to trigger a cataclysmic, extraordinary event that will enable them to rise the phoenix of tyranny from the ashes of global freedom. Folks, I'm telling you right now, I don't know what form it'll take. I don't know what the day is. I don't know what the hour is. I don't have that privilege. But I can tell you this. Those who are not looking at this in its truest light and understanding where this is headed are willfully refusing to recognize the obvious. That the elements that are converging on a global level to create the perfect storm of world events, to enable the clampdown of a very, very, very dangerous level of tyranny. And when you've got guys out there like Mr. Think Tank Ullman, who is basically saying that we need an extraordinary crisis to preserve the New World Order, the one that really comes to mind is a global financial crisis. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to tackle our third topic. The NSA will continue in their illegal efforts despite the presidential promises that he's going to rein in these agencies. Before we get there, make sure that you visit our friends over at Patriot Cigar and Tobacco. Those folks can be found at 2 Court Square or reached via phone at 417-257-1776. And Wits End Classic Barbershop, right there on the square in West Plains. Great place to get a haircut and a shave. Law offices of Jason Henry at number 10 Court Square, 417-256-4100 for all of your needs related to criminal activity, any kind of criminal charges that you've been hit with, both federal and state. Make sure that you see Jason Henry to solve those problems for you. Our friends over at Pizza Hut on Porter Wagoner in West Plains, they offer a great lunch special, salad, and a pizza bar and pasta bar every day. And then families eat free, or I should say kids eat free on family night on Tuesday evenings. The Battery Station, and they are located at batterystation.com on the web. Very, very few of the products that they carry outside of the batteries and the flashlights are on that website, but you're certainly welcome to go there anyway. If not, you can call them and ask them if they have a product that you need at 417-257-7799. And then if you'd like to share with your friends how they can get America's Voice Now, you can call 415-325-0725 as our new listen line. You can listen to the show 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at your leisure and convenience. And it's a simple way to share with others the opportunity to hear AVN. You simply give them that listen line at 415-325-0725 and say, listen, just call this when next time you're on the road or on a drive. Text them the phone number maybe and say, hey, here's a number you ought to call and just listen to this radio program for a little while. It's a great chance for them to hear the program and become a new listener. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the presidential decree or statement that he's going to begin to rein in the NSA, which I think all of us know is really a lot of bluster and bluff. He's stating that because the public opposition is clearly out there from non-state actors, according to Mr. Ullman, like Mr. Snowden. He recognizes that an extraordinary crisis is needed, and he's utilizing the NSA and the FBI and all these other administrative agencies to accomplish that. I tell you what, I don't see any end to the NSA stuff in sight, irrespective of all the promises. We'll be right back.
It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
All right. Good morning, America. You're listening to America's Voice Now. We're in our third segment of the morning. And we're talking this morning in reference to the issue of the NSA and the president's claims that he intends to begin to limit the NSA's reach with some I believe to be false or illusory concepts that won't really actually do much at all to slow this down. One of the things that they're talking about is giving the data that they're storing as they're vacuuming all of this massive amounts of data up. I mean, there was an article out the other day that the NSA is drawing everybody's text messages, right? Where are they storing all this data? They're storing it in NSA facilities. And now the talk is out there that maybe what they should do is allow the carrier to maintain and hold all this information. Furthermore, I think the mistake that the president has made in his concept is that what he's alleging here is that the NSA should not spy on foreign entities, and we should give them the same protections that we give to Americans. In all of my arguments against the NSA spying, never once have you heard me say that we shouldn't be spying on terrorists. We should be. What I have said is that we shouldn't be spying on our allies. In other words, the idea that, we're sitting there and we're monitoring Angela Merkel's phone and the president of Brazil's phone, and that we're sitting there at the G20 and we're siphoning up and vacuuming up the words and the texts and the emails and the faxes of our alleged partners is wrong. And I think it is. I don't suggest that governments don't spy on each other. They do. But I believe that the idea here is not that we should be limiting the NSA spying on non-citizens. My concern is that we're utilizing this as a tool to develop a tyranny database on Americans themselves. Now, do I care if you're spying on the communications of known state and non-state actors, such as Iran, such as Syria, such as Afghanistan and Iraq and countries that, for all intents and purposes, have declared an open and hostile position against the United States? Of course not. And you see, that's where the president's mistake is. He's stating that he wants to extend constitutional protections that are inherent to Americans to non-Americans. And I believe, to be honest with you, that there's a bit of a game afoot here where this president is, like he has shown us to have done so many times before, working not necessarily for the betterment of America, but for the improvement of factions and powers which are anti-American in their basic functional premise. In other words, when we take a look at the Iranian deal that's being cut as we speak, the administration is so desperate to be able to point to a legacy, quote unquote, that they're willing to sacrifice the safety and security of Americans to accomplish that. Ladies and gentlemen, that is so far outside the scope of what I would look at a president's, where does his loyalty lie? To his legacy or to you and your family? to you and your city, to your state, to the 300 million Americans that could be damaged or injured by the advent of an actor like Iran getting nuclear weapons. I mean, it's ridiculous. He's so desperate for, and the Iranians have come right out and said, we've bested the Americans here. They've capitulated to our demands. We're in control, and we can break this deal anytime we want and immediately go right back to the manufacture and the production of these weapons of mass destruction. And with all due respect, I do fear the capability of a state and or a non-state actor being able to utilize a weapon like that against either us or one of our allies, which would ultimately give them the, and to borrow Mr. Ullman's phrase, the extraordinary crisis they need to reassert the New World Order mentality and allow tyranny to lock us down with an iron fist. Make no mistake about it, folks. Their goal here is to figure out how we can utilize something like this to force a global crisis, utilizing that crisis as the excuse. Now, the president is sitting here saying we're going to protect Americans by not holding all this data, and that if we make Verizon hold their metadata and AT&T hold their metadata, that we can go in and get it when we need it, but only on those. Well, look, the truth of the matter is there is no fine line between how far the agency should go and what reaches into abuse. You've reached into abuse when you have open access to the data, and I don't care whether it's held in your basement or in the library down the road. If you've got open 24-hour access to it and you hold the key to the library, do I really care where it's stored? Or is that just some fanciful excuse that you're giving me to make me feel a false sense of security? And that's essentially what it is. Patrick Leahy the other day came out and he made a statement. On NSA spying, he's stating that we need to stop government from controlling the American people. Now, there's a video tied to this link, and I want you to go find it and watch it. But what I really want you to recognize is that Leahy is right on one aspect. We need to stop government from controlling the American people. He has the problem right. He just has the wrong solution. His solution is for oversight, more oversight from government. And I'm suggesting that that's an analogy of the foxes guarding the hen house. Two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner is not going to work out well in the sheep's future. We don't need the oversight of a dystopian surveillance state by a corrupted Congress who's already shown us that they are subjected to and willing to capitulate to coercion, and then whatever pressures are mounted upon them, whether they be financial or whether those are, we don't know what the triggers are. But Congress, for all intents and purposes, has been blackmailed into betraying us on a routine basis. So we don't need oversight of a dystopian surveillance state by these same people in Congress who are only looking for a way to do it where they can shift the blame to someone else in a CYA manner. We need definitive prohibitions based on constitutional principles that we all have an inherent right to privacy. Not because the Constitution says so, but because history tells us and the facts tell us that when anyone has the wherewithal and the capability to begin to retain such a vast database of information on individuals, that one, it will be used, and it will be used wrongfully. to adhere to the idea that Congress has the 1, backbone, 2, intelligence, 3, objectivity, and 4, the best interests of the populace at large to do the job of overseeing this surveillance state, this 1984 dystopian monster that's brewing and growing as we speak, is ridiculous. Jefferson said to us, in questions of power, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. In questions of power, let no more be heard of confidence in man. I have no confidence in an oversight from Congress. I have no confidence in an oversight from the president. I have no confidence in the concept that Verizon can become a massive storehouse that they have the keys to. We don't want to trust the oversight of a body already guilty of betrayal of the same values that they promised to protect. How insane is that? How can you possibly justify that? Now, Leahy came out and he made a fairly intelligent observation here, which I don't give Leahy credit for a lot, but in this case, he's right. He says the American people are at risk of being controlled by their government due to the expansive surveillance powers of the National Security Agency. He was talking on Fox News Sunday, and he's a Democrat now out of Vermont, right? But he's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, so he's not a lightweight no-name. And he was talking to Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday, and he basically stated that lawmakers have to act to return control of the government to the people. Well, I wouldn't disagree with that, but I would agree with his premise and his statement, but I would disagree completely with the manner in which he intends to do it, and also his true motives and intentions, and the methodology which he would employ to do that, because he's not really going to return control of the government to the people by insisting that government be the overseer of something which they allowed to grow right up underneath their own nose in the first place, is he? He says, I think we are going to maintain our ability to protect the United States. That's extremely important. The concern everybody has is allowing our government to have such a reach into your private life, my private life, and everybody else's, that we have the government controlling us instead of us controlling the government. And that's what both Republicans and Democrats are joined together on the Hill to try to change. See, when he ends his statement with that line, that's when you know that he's full of poop. He was right up until he said that last sentence. The concern everybody is having is allowing our government to have a reach into our private life and everybody else's, and the government controlling us instead of us controlling the government. But what I can definitively tell you is that both Democrats and Republicans are not joined together on the Hill to try to change that. They are joined together on the Hill to try to figure out how they can even more deeply embed the thorn under the skin. When he was questioned earlier on in the program, he was suggesting that viewers should consider history when they decide whether the government should have so much access to private communications. Here's what he said. I just think that there should be oversight. Well, right there is your problem. How can you, who have already been coerced and co-opted and for all intents and purposes, you have been blackmailed, how can you possibly say that you can realistically be in oversight of anything? He goes on to say, think back in the history of this country in J. Edgar Hoover's day and all. If he had had the power when he was spying on protesters and those against the Vietnam War and Martin Luther King, if he had had the power that's in here, think what might have happened. We Americans believe in our safety. We also believe in our ability to be private. You still have to have some checks and balances before you have a government that can run amok. Now, I'm already suggesting that we are living in a state of tyranny right now. That what he's suggesting is that if he had the power that's in here, think what might have happened. We're already seeing what's happening. The tone and the tenor of the press, the media, alternative media, writers, authors, publishers, it's all changing already. We're seeing it change right now as we speak. People are silencing themselves for fear of retribution. Wow. The change is already afoot. It's not whether or not it will happen. Excuse me, I am so hoarse. It's already happening. And I suggest that there is no member of Congress that can sit here and give us an assurance that they can do the job of protecting us from our own government, because they are a part and parcel of that same exact government. You can't expect that government has the capability and the wherewithal to protect you from itself. It doesn't, and it will never accomplish that task. Feinstein came out the other day, and this should be a warning to every American. Franken Feinstein came out here and says the metadata program is here to stay. So these people are contradicting themselves. Senate Intelligence Committee Chairwoman Dianne Feinstein predicted Sunday that lawmakers who favored shutting down the bulk collection of telephone metadata would not be successful in their efforts as Congress weighs potential reforms to the nation's controversial intelligence program. I don't believe so, says Feinstein. The president has very clearly said that he wants to keep the capability. Well, listen to what she says now. So I think we would agree with him. I know a dominant majority of everybody, virtually except 2 or 3 on the Senate Intelligence Committee, would agree with that. Now listen to how she says that. First of all, she's saying that the president has very clearly said he wants to keep the capability. So I think we would agree with him and should agree with him. Really? Well, who do you represent? The President of the United States? Or do you represent the people of California, Madam Feinstein? Or do you represent the United States of America? I don't think by a statement like that you're showing that you truly, accurately, objectively represent anyone other than your own personal interest and that of the party that you represent. She goes on to say, still, I think we would agree with him. I know a dominant majority of everybody, virtually, except 2 or 3 on the Senate Intelligence Committee would agree with that. So here, the sycophantic mess actually admits the truth. I know a dominant majority of and then she pauses and says everybody, and then she and steps back from that and says virtually, except for 2 or 3. Which is it, madam? Which is it? The dominant majority? Everybody? Virtually everybody? Or except for 2 or 3? First of all, the reforms that Obama is tossed out there as the panacea, the aspirin to get rid of the American headache of tyranny, is so minor in its scope. It's sitting there. It's like trying to say, well, here's 2 aspirin to quell the pain of an amputation. He's suggesting that in his goals that judicial approval be obtained before reviewing databases of information about telephone calls. Okay, but that sounds nice. But we've seen already the FISA court rubber stamps everything anyway. So, I mean, that's like saying, you got to go ask your mother for permission, but knowing full well that she's going to give permission every time. So you're basically saying to the kid, you can do whatever you want. I mean, it's ridiculous. He's also extended these protections, alleged protections, to non-American actors. And that's a mistake. I mean, Feinstein really has a lot of gall. She came out and said, a lot of the privacy people don't understand that we still occupy the role of the great Satan. New bombs are being devised. New terrorists are emerging. New groups, actually. A new level of viciousness. We need to be prepared. I think we need to do it in a way that respects people's privacy rights. Let me tell you something. Your actions don't belie your words, or do belie your words. They do not represent the statement that you end this with. I think we need to do it in a way that respects people's privacy rights. You're tramping the privacy rights people in the first sentence, and in the last sentence, you're saying that we need to do it in a way that respects their rights so that you have some plausible deniability for your treason. Mike Rogers, a Republican, he called the speech a victory. He says, the most important victory was the president standing up and saying, hey, the program did not have abuses. This wasn't sinister. It wasn't a rogue agency. It was legal and proper. Well, then I'm going to remind you again of two phrases that you absolutely must understand. One, how many times must we go through this exercise? Quote, you seem to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions. A very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. In other words, you can't say to me that a court says it's legal, because no court has that authority. That was Thomas Jefferson. And then Alexander Hamilton went on to expound that idea on both the Supremacy Clause and the Supreme Court by saying, I maintain that that the word supreme imports no more than this, that the Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof cannot be controlled or defeated by any other law. The acts of the United States, therefore, will be absolutely obligatory as to all the proper objects and powers of the general government. But the laws of Congress are restricted to a certain sphere. And when they depart from this sphere, they are no longer supreme or binding. You can't justify terrorism, government-sponsored tyranny, and treason by utilizing a court that has no authority to make that determination in the first place as the justifiable excuse. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to America's Voice Now. All right. We're in our last and final segment for today. Please make sure if you get an opportunity to that you find our website where you can learn more about what we the things that we think about and talk about. The idea that government has a right to lord it over us and or our states is a major malfunction in the political discourse. And there's no court that can justify and eliminate states' rights to be, 1, self-determinate, 2, sovereign, and 3, the actual creators of the federal government and therefore the federal government's master. Each, in the eyes of our Constitution, the states and the federal government, each have their limited and clarified authorities and powers. But they are very, very clear. And they are not to be transgressed or expounded or expanded upon. There's no authority for that. Now, Missouri is in the forefront of the states that are fighting to restore and reestablish our own individual state sovereignty. It's a movement that has been taking off now for a couple of years, and they're utilizing, those states that are wise about it, are utilizing the idea of the principles of nullification to accomplish that goal. Missouri has just recently filed its second variant of the Second Amendment Preservation Act. The first was vetoed by the governor last year. They've made changes to it to eliminate any arguments that he may have with it and still retain its teeth. The state of Missouri has also put forth other sovereignty-preserving legislation. They, the other day, filed an anti-Obamacare legislative initiative that says no one, federal government or otherwise, can force a citizen of the state of Missouri to buy and purchase insurance against their will. Now, they also have filed, and this is an excellent piece of legislation, the anti-Common Core legislation. Now, why do I say that this is an excellent piece of legislation? Well, I'm going to tell you why. Because it's short, it's sweet, and it's to the point. And it leaves no room for interpretation or erroneous interpretation. Let's clarify it. Here's what the entire piece of legislation says. Notwithstanding any other law, the State Board of Education shall not adopt, and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education shall not implement the Common Core state standards developed by the Common Core Standards Initiative. Any action taken to adopt or implement the Common Core state standards as of the effective date of this section are void. Common Core state standards or any other statewide education standards shall not be adopted or implemented without the approval of the General Assembly. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the entire text. It's short, it's sweet, it's to the point. It's the way legislation should be written. Not thousands of pages of verbal diarrhea with hidden clauses, buried treasons, and giveaways for pals and partners of and cronies of the administration or the writer or the state that the alleged representative hails from. Frankly, my only problem with this is that it says that any action taken to adopt or implement the Common Core standards as of the effective date of this section are void. Frankly, I'd rather see the thing go back to the beginning and say retroactively any portion of Common Core that has currently been instituted must be removed. But you see, it's a move in the right direction because it's establishing that which the states do have the authority and the right to utilize. Now, the anti-Obamacare plan is this one. This one is House Bill or Senate Bill, 546, and it was put out there by Senator John Lamping. Now, This one says the same very, very basic and simple language. No law or rule shall compel, directly or indirectly, any person, employer, or healthcare provider to participate in any healthcare system. Gotta love it. What's even more important is that it goes beyond that, and it states that not only can no law be passed, or rule or law that would compel her, directly or either indirectly, but it says that in the event that any attempt is made that way, that the state attorney general must defend that individual or business or whatever entity, any person, employer, or healthcare provider. So in other words, the states are exercising their 10th Amendment authority and their 10th Amendment required duty to protect us from a federal government that is clearly operating well outside the boundaries of its federal authority. The federal authority granted to it by the states themselves. See, the challenge here is that we've allowed the federal government to so usurp the states' authorities that it's hard even to get the states to admit that they should be taking their rights back. They've become so accustomed, so indoctrinated with the idea of tyranny from afar in Washington, D.C., that it's difficult for the state representatives and such to get their head around the fact that we have the right to nullify that which is unauthorized, illegal, and unconstitutional. How dare I make such a statement? Because the Supremacy Clause rules the day, you hear. Well, I maintain, says Alexander Hamilton, I maintain that the word supreme imports no more than this, that the Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof cannot be controlled or defeated by any other law. So, if the law is made, and it's made in pursuance with the constitutional authorities that are delegated and limited to the federal government, or in the state government for that matter, that they cannot be controlled or defeated by any other law. If the federal government makes a law that is within the constitutional authority granted to it, delegated to it by the states, then no state has the right to say, we're not going to follow that. What does that mean? That means that, as an example, if the federal government makes a determination that they're going to pass a law which is within the boundaries of their constitutional authority related to, let's say, highways and roads, or the ability to create the monetary, or to unify the monetary system. Not under this fiat currency we've subdelegated to the Fed, but under a real monetary system where the Treasury is truly in charge, then those states don't have a right to kick back and say, no, we're not going to follow that. Because it's done in pursuance of the constitutional authority granted to the federal government itself. But recognize something. He goes on to say, the acts of the United States will be absolutely obligatory as to all the proper objects and powers of the general government. But here's where he stops and he says, now let me tell you the opposite side of this. He goes on to say, but the laws of Congress are restricted to a certain sphere, a limited circle. And when they depart from this sphere, they are no longer supreme nor binding. Now, how does that relate to the principles of nullification? Well, very clearly, what the argument is in favor of nullification is that when they have proven themselves to be no longer supreme or binding because Congress has stepped outside of its restricted sphere of authority, that the states have the right to nullify those principles. And I got to tell you, it's funny to me when I hear people talk about nullification. They say the Supremacy Clause overrides that. That was settled during the Civil War. I beg to differ. The Supremacy Clause has no bearing on, and the concepts of nullification have everything to do with today's modern. You're seeing nullification by Colorado and California, Washington State right now, as they reject federal law on marijuana. Is that not nullification? A state that says, irrespective of what federal law declares on marijuana, you can use it for not medicinal purposes, not any purpose other than pure recreational, I want to get high purpose. That's nullification, ladies and gentlemen. And isn't it funny that the same people who would throw nullification under the bus when it doesn't work for their purposes are the same ones to employ it when they want to have legalized marijuana? You can't have it both ways. You either believe in nullification or you don't. But you can't say it's okay for the states to separate themselves and go outside of the principles of the Supremacy Clause when it's something that we all want a lot of, but not when it's something we disagree with. How do you balance that with the rule of law then? If that's the case, then we don't have a rule of law. And if we don't have a rule of law, then we really don't have anything further to talk about. That means that the republic is done. It's finished. If what you're saying is that the Supremacy Clause overrides every opportunity that a state would have to say, we don't believe that the federal government has the authority to make that determination, and so therefore we are not going to honor it. And by the way, we've seen nullification in other instances as well. Did you know, for the record, by the way, that the principles of nullification were exercised when the fugitive slave law was passed in 1800? Did you know that the Republicans, not the Democrats, were the ones who were responsible for saying, you can pass a federal fugitive slave law that requires me to notify a slaveholder that I've got his slave here. But I'm going to tell you right now, we're not doing it. We're not going to follow that law because it's a moral issue. It's one where the federal government doesn't have the right to tell us that we can go against our own moral belief related to slavery. The Democrats, by the way, folks, were the ones who were trying to push that. The idea of a slave must be returned to his owner under penalty of law. How the Democrats seem now to consider themselves to be the champion of the downtrodden, the poor, and the minority population, especially related to blacks. And I don't call them African Americans; they're Black Americans. Okay, is a ridiculous revision of history. The truth of the matter is, nullification was used, and it was used effectively to say the fugitive slave law will not apply in our state. We're not obligated to do it. We're not gonna, and that's the end of it. You can apply that law in Washington if you want, but here in our state, it's not going to fly. It's that simple. It was applied by Jefferson and Madison when they said, you can pass the Sedition Act, but in our state, you can't arrest someone for speaking out against the President of the United States or the Congress, which is a clear First Amendment violation. Passed by, of all people, John Adams. Yep. How many of you knew that? John Adams was the president at the time that the Sedition Act, and it was called the Alien and Sedition Act because there were two of them that were passed simultaneously. But the principles of nullification were applied then. They were applied during the Fugitive Slave Act. They've been applied many, many, many times since then, including states that have chosen, for all intents and purposes, to limit the Second Amendment rights of their citizens. Think about it for a moment. The state of Colorado, the state of New York, the state of Connecticut, those states have severely limited the rights of their citizens to own firearms. Now, they have effectively gone against the Constitution and the federal law of the land. So they are effectively utilizing nullification to a negative end. Isn't it interesting that those are the self-same states that say, the state of Missouri, as an example, cannot use nullification to say, you don't have a right to tell our citizens what their gun rights are. Kind of funny that, isn't it? I mean, if you want to see the ultimate example of irony and hypocrisy, go look at the way in which states like New York and Connecticut and Colorado talk about, and Maryland, talk about the principles of nullification. When it's something that does not fit their pre-described bias, their predefined dictatorial rule, they're dead set against it. But when they want to usurp authority, when they want to limit the rights of their citizens and their right to own firearms, which is a right given to us by God, not by man, then they turn around and say, we can use nullification for our purposes, but you can't use it for yours. That, ladies and gentlemen, is hypocrisy. Missouri is leading this role or this push for 10th Amendment sovereignty to be returned back to the states as a method and a manner and a means to rule to rein in the federal government, to bring the federal government back to the point where it is not making determinations that affect negatively that state's citizens. They have a right to interpose themselves and to defend and protect their citizenry from an overbearing tyrant. The creation, the birth that they gave to the federal government, they have the right to stand before what's now become the monster and defend their citizenry. That is, in fact, their obligation and their duty to their citizens. They owe their citizens an allegiance of protection before they owe their federal government, their creation, an allegiance of authority to rule them. Make no mistake about it. Our founders were very clear. They made it extraordinarily clear that under no circumstances were states obliged to accept the rules and the regulations passed down by a government operating outside of its constitutionally delegated authority. And make no mistake about it, folks, there are only some 26 powers that are appointed to the federal government. And the 10th Amendment is very clear that those powers which are not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states, respectively, and or the people. The people retain the bulk of the rights. The states are given limited delegated authority, and they in turn are permitted to only delegate that authority to the federal government, which was clearly delineated and outlined as their 26 foundational functions. Anything outside of that scope has no basis in reality and it is void, and that is not supreme, it is not binding, and it is void as if it had no effect. Missouri is not alone. The 10th Amendment Center actually not only helps states identify the legislative processes and procedures to go through to pass these sovereignty reestablishment procedures, but in addition to that, they also keep track of what states have got what legislation where. And I would strongly encourage you to go and visit the 10th Amendment Center. It's just like it's spelled. There's no numbers. It's 10th, T-E-N-T-H. 10th Amendment Center, I believe it's .org. They're a great organization. And they have model legislation that any state can pick and say, when I go through this, all I've got to do is, change the name of the state and so forth and so on. It's basically a template. Then you have to run it, of course, past your state constitution to make sure that it's in line with that and get it submitted. But folks, we're running out of time to do those things. So I encourage you, if you've got influence over your state legislators, to get these bills where the states restore their sovereignty as quickly as possible. Before we jump for the day, I just want to thank our sponsors because those are the guys that keep us on the air. So when you hear these sponsors and you patronize them over and above anyone else you would normally go to, you're doing so because it helps keep us on the air, which helps us to continue to share with you. The battery station over in West Plains at 303 Washington Avenue, 417-257-7799, or batterystation.com. Our friends at Pizza Hut, where you can go and get yourself a nice hot meal for lunch, salad bar, and a pizza bar, as well as a pasta bar every day. And in addition to that, on Tuesday night, family night, kids under 12 eat free. Make sure that when you get in there, you say, I just wanted to let the manager know that I heard about this on America's Voice Now, and Mike sent me over to here. Make sure that you get a hold of Jason Henry if you've got a legal issue that needs dealing with, whether that's a criminal case or a civil case, or whether it is a personal injury related to an automobile accident. Make sure that you get to the law offices of Jason Henry. You can reach him at 417-256-4100. He'll be more than happy to sit down and go over the case with you and help you to determine what is the next right move to make. Please make sure that you visit our friends over at Patriot Cigar Bar, Cigar and Tobacco Shop. They can be reached over at number 2 Court Square, right on the square in West Plains. And they have a great selection of pipes and tobacco and cigars and every accessory known to the smoking world. You can find it all right there. You can call them also at 417-257-1776. They can ship cigars to you, by the way. And then also, while you're there, go in and see my friend Jason for a good haircut. He cuts my hair about once a week, maybe every 10 days, and does a great job for me. And I'm very appreciative of his friendship, his support, and the great job he does. So you're listening to America's Voice. Please make sure that you find us at americasvoicenow.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/America's Voice Now. Please make sure you hit the like button. You can find every program that we do on video on youtube.com/America's Voice Now. And then you can also find us on Patriot FB, that's Patriot like Foxtrot Bravo, .com, where you can listen to Patriot Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can listen to some other great radio hosts, including J.J. McCartney and Midnight Patriot Radio. Make sure that you get over there and listen as quickly as you possibly can. You can also listen to us right here on 99.3 Big Country 99 in the heart of South Central Missouri. Okay, we're wrapping for the day. We'll see you tomorrow. I'll get my voice back, folks. Just give me a day or so. Have a great day.